Welcome to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth, and we're here to preserve and promote culture, one weekly conversation at a time. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show through iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, Google Play, and a whole bunch of other venues. Just visit our sites, chimeraobscura.com/VM or vmspod.com to find more information, along with our RSS feed. And follow the show on Twitter and Instagram at VMSPod. Well, I made it through my birthday last week with a minimum of effort, so that was good. A couple of brief calls with my immediate family, emails and texts with some pals, a few nice cards, some presents that showed up a couple of days later. Okay, books. People always know to send me books, and a couple of those showed up in the days afterward. But it's, I don't know. It's kind of nice having a birthday so soon after New Year's Day. Sorry, still COVID coughing. See, lots of people get all or nothing about like New Year's resolutions. But for me, I get an extra week and a half or so to see what sticks and, otherwise get myself a mulligan. On anything I want to change in my life. Like if maybe I made a decision to do X, Y, or Z on January 1st. Didn't quite work out, but, by the birthday, I figure out how to fine tune that or throw it out the window. I also use the high holidays every fall as an occasion for that. But, I guess that sort of highlights the arbitrariness, the arbitrariness of those change points. Like if you really want to, or if you need to make a change in your life, there's nothing stopping you from today, Anyway, let's get on with the show. No point in my prattling on about this sort of stuff. My guest this week is Ross Benjamin, whose new book is it's a translation of the Diaries of Franz Kafka. It's out now from Schocken Books, and it's just a goddamn marvel, this thing. Ross is one of the first translators I ever recorded with in early 2016, and we talked about this project then. And it's great to see it complete and in the flesh, as it were, because any project involving Kafka can get weird, and this one had its twists and turns, etc. But it's such an achievement. I'll talk about it in a minute. But the diaries themselves have a bit of a twisted history. See, Kafka's friend and literary executor, Max Brod, edited and organized the initial German edition of the diaries. And in the process, he either cut or melded a lot of stuff. And Ross will talk about that and why this edition was necessary. And he also polished up the language and sometimes did that for literary effect. Sometimes his edits, I'm talking about Max here, Max's edits cut negative references about himself. Sometimes he removed mentions of Kafka's sex life or social life or bodily imagination, and some homoerotic stuff that's in there. So anyway, the English version of the edited diaries came out in like 1948-49. But in 1990, a complete version of the diaries came out in German. And that's what Ross worked from to bring us this amazing edition. So the diaries cover 1909 to 1923, and they are just a revelation in a lot of ways. And they bring us a human Kafka, one who attended plays with his pals and visited bordellos and had some of those aforementioned homoerotic thoughts or observations. But beyond that, what Ross does and what the diaries do is what he describes in his intro as quote unquote, quote unquote, catching Kafka in the act of writing. That is, the diaries are filled with literary drafts, first stabs at what would become some of his stories and unfinished novels, and attempts that never congealed or never became something that Kafka decided to publish. And in some cases, we see variations crop up again and again. A repeat of a certain intro or theme that he starts playing out in different ways, sometimes like a dozen times. And we could see him working through these pieces, expanding and cutting and finding these different threads to follow and different ways of sort of constructing, what he'll lead us to. And we see the writing right in front of us, not just the finished product, but, all of the things that went into what made a Kafka piece of writing a piece of Kafka's writing. And we also get this looser, less polished writer. There's an informal tone sometimes that reminds us that we're reading diaries, and they were never intended for publication. But we're getting a peek into what this man decided to write. And we should note Kafka, as is famously known, instructed Max Brod to burn all his papers after his death, which was a task that Brod did not undertake. And Ross and I talk about that, just as I talked about it last year with Andreas Kilcher and Judith Butler, trying to understand, trying to get their take on what Kafka was thinking and how serious he was about having all his papers destroyed. Anyway, about the diaries, Ross does an amazing job with the text. And in his intro, he contrasts some of his passages with those of the 1948-49 English edition. And he, in the process, demonstrates not just the benefits of a fuller, unexpurgated approach to Kafka, but also the living nature of language and what it means to not kind of convert everything into High German and, clean up everything for the sake of some literary stature. It's all about the living language, like I say, and the topics and themes that maybe seem verboten once upon a time. This edition, it's absolutely wonderful as a physical object, getting to see the book in print, and the heft of it, and everything about it is just fantastic. I've read about 125 pages so far, and it feels like I'm discovering an old friend, albeit a weird old friend, but one whose voice and words kind of resonate in my mind more than a century, after the words are written down. It's an amazing achievement, this book, and it's a monumental undertaking on Ross's part. I could go on, but I'll do that in the conversation itself. For now, suffice to say, the Diaries of Franz Kafka is a monumental achievement. It brings Kafka new life and changes how English readers will see Kafka as a person in addition to as a writer. And the translation by Ross makes it an absolute joy to read. It promises to be a book any writer will dive into again and again for years. And it's not something you need to read linearly. It's clear from the way Kafka wrote in his diaries, he would just grab whatever notebook was at hand. So a lot of the stuff isn't chronological necessarily. It's just, this is a resource and a treasure. So here's Ross's bio from the book. Ross Benjamin's translations include Friedrich Hölderlin's Hyperion, Joseph Roth's Job, Danielle Kellman's You Should Have Left, and Till. He was awarded the 2010 Helen and Kurt Wolff Translators Prize for his rendering of Michael Marr's Speak Nabokov, and he received a Guggenheim Fellowship for his work on Franz Kafka's diaries. And now, the 2023 Virtual Memories Conversation with Ross Benjamin. So this is pretty much the 7th anniversary of our getting together. It's just about this time in 2016. And luckily, nothing has happened worldwide that's, anything. So we don't need to catch up on that. But you were a few years in to this project of translating Kafka's diaries. What took you so long?
Well, yeah, it's definitely the most difficult project I've ever undertaken. I also did have two kids. I had only one when I started the project.
I was trying to remember, but
yeah. I started, by the time you spoke to me, I had two kids, but the project is older than my second child. And they've never known me to be doing anything else. This is my entire job to them, is just Kafka. And that's my daughter found it easier to remember that I do Kafka than to remember translation as the name of my career. So she would just, if people asked, what I do, she would chime in, Daddy does Kafka.
I shudder to ask, was it one of her first words?
No.
Oh, good. Okay.
Thank goodness. What most, and there's a whole saga of publishing too. I started with a different publisher and ended up changing publishers, I would say midway, but it was pretty late in the process, relatively late. But the main thing, obviously, is just the difficulty of the translation. In most translations that I've done, I reach a point where I feel very convinced of my choices, and that's when I know that I've arrived.
Yeah. And
there's no sense of arrival with Kafka. You can always circle back and elicit doubt in yourself about your choices, and about your basically about everything to do with Kafka. You can circle back and start doubting again, and circling back almost always leads to doubting, as opposed to leading to greater to a greater sense of closure or
clarity or refinement or anything.
Thank you. Yeah, or certainty. And that's a very it's a very characteristic pattern of Kafka's own creativity too, to sort of be self-undermining, and there's something there's something at the core of the work that
is the language itself unstable.
Absolutely. It's the ambiguity of it and the slipperiness of it is endemic and not to be overcome. Yeah. So somehow you have to translate something that is relatively baffling to you. And if by the end it's less baffling to you, you feel you haven't done it justice, because it needs to still be as multivalent and as slippery as the original. And that's very different from most things I translate, where while I recognize that, there's provisionality to all translation, and you can always retranslate, and you can always find, and to all interpretation, all reading, and so on, you can always come back and look at it differently or look at it anew. Nonetheless, I usually do find at some point I feel I've successfully decoded things. Maybe I've missed something, but I don't know I've missed it. Yeah. Here, the decoding process can't really ever be completed. And so it becomes, it can become a self-perpetuating cycle.
When we talked in 16, you'd mentioned, I think you were up to like 1914. The diaries begin around 1909, right? Mm-hmm. And that aspects of, as you progress through it, it led you to go back to the early ones and start revising what you were. Was there a sense of, I have to lock down either chronologically or, just segmenting certain stuff off? Was there any point of I know, like you say, it can never be complete, but, a sense where, you just had to give yourself cutoff points for, okay, I can't go back to notebook 1 anymore. We have to consider this as done as it can be. And then, of course, the whole project, but,
Yeah, that is just, at some point, I just had to, it's hard to say. I don't know how I ever finished, because I could always go back, and circumstances were such that there were other delays occurred that were external to the project, obviously. And not only COVID, but there were other things that happened, other unfortunate occurrences that delayed the project. And then that just gave me the gift of the
self-recrimination and doubt,
the gift of more time to continue to go back, and it did feel like I could always backtrack. And in fact, moving forward, like you said, would lead me back because I would hit upon some new insight into his use of language or into another layer of meaning to a type of thing. Because he's always circling back, right? So he's always creating new iterations of the same dilemmas in his diaries, and it would give me some new insight into how he articulated that dilemma that maybe then made me go back and rethink earlier decisions. So there's this circularity to Kafka always that ended up being there even at the microscopic level of linguistic choices, of word choices. Yeah. And some of it wasn't all unsatisfying. Sometimes the greater insight I felt I gained later on in the text would lead me to feel some sense of revelation, like, okay, I think I know what he means when he uses this particular expression. So I don't want to overstate it, although it's hard to overstate how much doubt Kafka instills in his translator, especially as a diarist, in writing hastily and not necessarily himself always thinking out how he wants to articulate what he's writing. I mean, in some sense, when Kafka was writing, he was always also thinking about writing and literary articulation. But in another sense, when you're writing in your diary, you don't need to reach any sense of finality. This is how I want to express this thing. Right. It now contains my intention or something. You can just scribble something, think, oh, that doesn't make sense, or not even think about whether it really makes sense, and then keep scribbling. So that leads to a whole other layer of wondering about whether he even knew what he was saying at times. And here I am trying to figure out what he's saying, and it may be hopeless. Right.
I mean, you get those multiple layers, both of, trying to understand the sometimes the context of what he's doing, the fictionality versus reality of it, and as you put it, the language itself, and the looseness of the language. The things that are fragmentary, the sentences where it's the words aren't quite adding up, but they're all there, and this is
I mean, sometimes he's writing in a kind of mental shorthand, where I think maybe I'm following his associative logic, but the logic is not really there in the syntax or the semantics. So I may be hallucinating the associations that I think I'm tracing, but it certainly would be a plausible way for him to be writing in a kind of, stenography of his consciousness where he's, where it doesn't really add up to the interpretation that I've come up with. That's something, again, where a lot you can rely on the finality of a finished product that you're translating. You can assume, well, if it's not there in the syntax, it's not there. Or in even the semantics, to the extent that you can pinpoint it. If it's not there, it's not there. But in this diary writing, there were times where I really thought, well, it could be a kind of associative logic that doesn't really make sense when you drill down. But it's the only way kind of it makes any sense for him to have done this.
And as a writer, you've got the evidence of what he could actually write, and the associative weirdness of his fiction that existed. So you can, like, in a sense, I guess, look at this as raw material and know, listen, somehow that end product ended up coming out of the same consciousness. So
and it's not always so radically different. Like, it's not like the diaries can definitely be way rougher than his published fiction, but it's also, he was shaping them in a literary way. And if you look at the facsimiles, he was crossing out and revising and reworking. And you see it in successive entries, too, that he'll be reworking the same material.
Yeah, the thing
he was always working on literary material.
On his, the being let down by his education, like the number of variants he does of that same piece
and that's
again
one of
and
those
again.
Situations where it seems like it's autobiography, but then at some point he says, like, I am a 40-year-old man and I'm short or something. And he was like a 26-year-old man who was really tall, especially for that era. That's another blurred. It's all blurred boundaries, but the fact is that even when he was writing entries that seemed like private entries and that he never reworked into fiction, I think everything was potentially a literary piece. There are entries that he extracted from his diaries, changed some names or replaced them with initials, and then published as literary pieces. And I think a lot of the entries that seem to be going in that direction but don't end up turning into that, just existence on some threshold between life and literature, but that he, I don't think he was ever purely in just, let's say, non-literary diarist mode, where you would just be... that's not fair either. Sometimes he's actually jotting pure marginalia, like some debts that he owes to somebody, and I guess that's just pure everyday mode. But once it's in the diaries, it gets blurred again. Yeah.
I guess it's a weird way to phrase it, but do you feel that you were qualified to do that? Looking back at who you were then and now seeing the finished book in front of you, I know this is a project that you originated, that you're interested in doing, but do you look back and think, I'm not sure I was qualified to be the translator of Kafka's diaries before actually translating Kafka's diaries?
Yeah, in a way, I'm not sure it's possible to be qualified to translate Kafka's diaries before you translate Kafka's diaries. It's only in the act of doing it maybe that you find out whether you are equal to the task. And as described, I was full of doubt through most of the project. It's satisfying now to have people reading the translation and responding to my version of the diaries with some of the excitement that I felt when I first read the German edition of these unfiltered diaries, and felt how much more alive and dynamic they were than the older editions that had been misrepresented and fashioned into a much more polished, less living and fluid.
Can you talk about that a little bit? Also, just why this edition was necessary.
So Max Brod was Kafka's most intimate friend and a champion of his work in his lifetime too, and very much the person who encouraged him to publish what he did publish in his lifetime, and who connected him. Brod was a very prolific writer who was much better known at the time when Kafka was alive, and really connected Kafka with his publishers and championed his work. And when Kafka died, he had instructed Brod in a letter to destroy all of his unpublished writings. And Brod disobeyed, and instead, almost immediately after Kafka's death, began the project of publishing the posthumous writings. And the diaries, he waited some time. By the time he prepared an edition of the diaries, he tidied up Kafka's prose significantly. Kafka wrote these diaries as we've discussed, in a sometimes hasty, very disorganized fashion. Not that he should have been organized. He was just setting down his thoughts and inner life and ideas in a notebook. But Brod imposed an organization on it, rearranging it, formalizing the language, polishing the syntax, and creating composites of rough drafts of literary work that Kafka wrote in the diaries. So Kafka would write a series of literary attempts at sort of variations of the same material, and there might be 11 or 20 that set off in alternative directions. And Brod would, instead of reproducing them as such, he actually pieced them together like a puzzle and created a smooth, cohesive whole, thereby necessarily leaving out many variations that didn't fit into his composite story. And then he censored material that he found potentially threatening to the image of Kafka that he was wedded to, which was a rather saintly image of a kind of martyr to literature who was at a remove from the earthly and the bodily and the sexual, and particularly the homoerotic, anything with just a tinge of homoerotic desire, of which there are a number of striking examples in the diaries. Brod deleted. And as a result, I think much more attention has been paid to those deleted passages than might have been if they had been there in the first place. I mean, they're kind of... there's no doubt that they're expressions of erotic desire toward other men, but it kind of ends there. There's not that much more to say about them, except for the fact that Brode found them unfit for publication, making it seem like there's this big secret about Kafka.
What I love, especially with your introduction to the piece, just kind of creating a more sensual human Kafka that, as ingenious as the fiction is, and the image that was crafted of, like you say, a martyr to literature, you bring a real human being alive in the course of this, which is just fantastic.
Yeah, I mean, he was absolutely somebody who, as anguished as he was in his inner life, outwardly enjoyed life, seemingly at least. From when you see, he loved swimming. He was always getting out to concerts and plays, and very stimulated and enthusiastic and inspired by the things that he saw. Even when he was inspired to criticism, he was very engaged in his world in Prague and among his friends, and deeply bonded to his friends, especially Max Brod. And they would go on trips together, a handful of trips. And he lived, he wasn't isolated, and he spent his nights isolated. He was out at night too, but he spent the time when he was writing in this deep internal sense of isolation. And he had this anguish and profound sense of alienation that he explored when he was writing. But I kind of have this picture in my head of him writing some of these intensely alienated, isolated sounding snippets, and then, putting on his collar, his detachable collar and tie, and going out into the, to go hang out with his friends at a cafe thereafter. And, he was reserved and quiet, but he was also known to burst out into laughter. And so there's that. And then there's the body, which is present everywhere in Kafka. Also, when you're paying attention, it's present in the doctored work too, in the polished up work, and in the work that Kafka himself cleaned up for publication. There's so much physicality in Kafka, and in the diaries in this form, I think it comes through so much more because it's not being presented in a more impersonal disembodied idiom, because the idiom too is embodied, where you see the sentences kind of fall apart, or you could sense that he's writing these sentences that they're coming from his body, and then he's also talking about his headaches, and his writing is so visceral. Actually, it's so much about gesture, about pain and sensitivity and symptoms, and those are all very present in this version of the diaries, but also throughout Kafka's work.
Yeah, how much editorial work did you need to do? You were basing on the early 90s German edition, you'd said, and they did an awful lot of the research in terms of trying to contextualize a lot of things. Was there additional, again, detective work you had to do in the process to kind of... I had to do
detective work. I didn't have to do editorial work in the sense of deciding how to shape the edition, other than adapting the notes from the German edition to make them fit better for an English-speaking audience. But that even there, that had to do with... I didn't need, for example, this is now pretty banal and maybe boring, but I didn't need to include, all the citations to German sources.
Sure.
And then, but I did need to include sometimes an explanation of what something was that you could presume German readers would know culturally, so that there was a little bit of, maybe it wasn't a little bit of work, but it's maybe I didn't make a huge imprint on the editorial framework by doing that work. It was actually a lot of work. But as for detective work for the translation, I had to do detective work that you didn't necessarily have to do to create the edition, because to create the edition, you can just reproduce his language. You don't always need to know the context. When it seems like a note is required, then you need to know the context. But here, there were times I needed to know the context in order to determine the translation. And now and then it led to my discovering something that hadn't been discovered by the editors of the German edition. I was in touch with the editor of the German edition, who was hugely helpful, and whose edition is, I'm all the more in awe of now that I've interacted with it at this level, and kind of double checked a lot of things in the process of translating them, and found how reliable their editorial Hans-Gerd Koch, it's the name of his editorial work is. Here and there, I wrote to him and he said, indeed, you're right. This was, so one example is where Kafka was writing about, he attended these plays by a traveling Yiddish theater troupe that gave guest performances in Prague, and he was moved to write numerous diary entries about the plays, summarizing them. They really had a profound influence on him. He forged a friendship with one of the actors, and had crushes on more than one of the actresses in this Yiddish theater troupe. And in describing the plays, he quotes from them from time to time. And there was one line in the German edition that baffled me that was a quote from the play. And I saw actually in this case that in the older edition by Max Brod, he had transcribed a word differently that made more sense to me. And the word was emes, the Yiddish word for truth. It would be emet in Hebrew. But in the transcription, in the edition I was translating, it was translated as the German word eines. So an I and an N, which could look like an M, especially if there's a little bit of ink missing. It would translate as all is one, which didn't quite make sense in the context of the play as much as all is truth. It's all true, what I'm saying. And then I knew Brod had attended these plays with Kafka and was more in a milieu where he would be familiar with the Yiddish words. And so I thought maybe Brod was right in this case, and I had to dig up the original play in order to confirm. And there, I had my Hebrew school level ability to read the letters phonetically and to find this passage in the play and confirm that it was indeed MS. And I went back to the editor and he said, oh, you're right.
And we get the, between Prague and Judaism, we get the golem issue, because MS was the inscription on the golem's head.
Exactly.
So we get to tie some other weird, Jewish folklore thing into Kafka that way too.
Yeah, it ties in. It's not a reference in the diaries because he's just quoting this moment in this play, but it ties in now, given that that's the word I had to track down, has its own kind of, set of associations.
Not that it needed a footnote of its own. It's okay.
Right,
I made my mental ones
MS,
instead.
Yeah. Wasn't it that there's a letter that you can change?
Well, if you delete the aleph, you get met, which is death. So one of the things I wonder, you mentioned how in this case Brod, actually made a change that turned out to be appropriate. Did you find yourself understanding why Brod did what he did, both in terms of not destroying Kafka's work, but also in shaping the image of who Kafka was?
I didn't feel tempted to do anything like what Brod did, if that's what you mean.
Yeah, not in terms of affecting your translation, but just
thinking about what it must have been like for him.
Yeah.
I think I kind of started with the assumption that I understood in a, personal way why he did what he did. I can imagine that if you decided to publish your friend's posthumous writings that he had asked you to destroy, and partially because you knew the standards that he held his writing to were so high that he was often reluctant to let it out into the world. And Brod disagreed with Kafka about how high his standards were. He thought, obviously, as we think, this is genius and should be read. But nonetheless, you knew the perfectionism of your friend and how tormented he would be to know people could see the imperfection of his work. Then you would think, well, I could on his behalf, and you would also overestimate your own ability to know how it should be presented, because Brod, of course, was a trusted friend of Kafka's in his lifetime. And
as you said, an accomplished writer. It's not like he was just some schlub,
Yeah. As an editor, I think what he did was a travesty, but as in terms of understanding his motivations, I understand them very well. I also think there is a way as an editor to present diaries discreetly if you want to. Like Susan Sontag's diaries are edited by her son, and in the introduction he says that I've decided what to leave in and what to take out based on sometimes my own, you know, you can kind of be transparent about it, and then also be transparent about how you're treating what you are leaving in, and be more responsible about that. You can leave it in with more accuracy and not kind of change anything at will that you feel like changing because you think it'll sound better this way, or be more flattering this way. But I also understand why he... I don't think he constructed this image as Kafka as a saint as a kind of propaganda move or a marketing move or a branding move. I think this is how he saw Kafka, especially after his death. He's not the only one who saw Kafka this way. I believe in Milena Jasenska, who was Kafka's first translator. She translated the Stoker into Czech, and their epistolary relationship turned into a very romantic epistolary relationship, resulting in just an incredibly moving collection of letters, his letters to Milena. Milena's obituary for Kafka, I think it's an obituary rather than an elegy. It's possible it's an elegy, but her tribute to Kafka upon his death describes him in much the same way, and she uses saintly language too. So I think that was his true perception of Kafka, and that he was making his choices in conformity with that perception, as opposed to just trying to boost, his friend's image in this way. That probably answers the question. Yeah.
Do you think Kafka was serious about wanting Brod to destroy everything? I brought it up with Andreas Kilcher and Judith Butler last year, and they thought he was probably messing with Brod, or at least that he knew Brod would never actually go through with destroying the documents. But what's your...
Well, I think it's true that he knew he was asking the one person who would never do it to do it, but that doesn't mean he didn't want him to do it, because this is Kafka. And I think when we try to find clues that allow us to pin down Kafka on one side or the other of something that seems unresolvable, we're missing the point about Kafka's ambivalence, which was that it's ambivalence in the true definition of the word ambivalence, meaning not just mixed feelings, but warring impulses, opposing feelings. Yeah. And Kafka had lifelong ambivalence about many things. And most of the time, you can find clues on one side or the other. Oh, he really wanted to be in a community. He really felt alienated from all community. Yeah. He thought marriage was the highest ideal. Oh, this is obviously a guy who never wants to get married. You can always find clues on either side of these ambivalences, because he was incapable or unwilling to ever resolve his ambivalences in one direction or another. So I think it's completely characteristic that he would ask for his writing to be destroyed by the one person he apparently knew would never destroy it, without that necessarily meaning that he therefore wanted it to live on into posterity and to have, a translator in a foreign country celebrating his new translation of his diaries 100 years after he died. It's possible that he dreaded that, or it's quite likely, I think, that he dreaded that as a kind of nightmare, as much as in his lifetime with publication too, he did care about the publications of his books. He oversaw the aesthetics of the editions that were published, and he put a ton of work into preparing the clean copies. And at the same time, in his diaries, you hear him lamenting that he let the work out into the world and wishing he could undo it and lock it back up in a box. I think it's always to misapprehend Kafka to interpret him one way or the other, because he was so often deeply conflicted in an unresolvable way.
Which, again, creates great dynamic tension when we're working on fiction and things like that.
Well, let me just say, I think that part of maybe why, I don't think the only reason he didn't ever, or he had so much trouble resolving his inner conflicts was some kind of just neurosis or something. I think he also found it to be the most fertile source of his genius and creativity. And we have evidence that it was, that he could, most people who suffered from the things he seems to suffer from psychically sound like a broken record because they're always kvetching about the same thing. And he's always kvetching about the same thing. But instead of him sounding like a broken record, it's now he's writing an animal story. Now he's writing a charmingly self-deprecating letter. Mm-hmm. Now he's writing aphorisms that are, almost riddles in their, enigmatic philosophical evocations. And he's he just was constantly reimagining this same sort of plight, and now he's doing social commentary that involves the same kind of hopelessness that he, all right, let's leave it at that.
Where did Kafka begin for you? Not the diaries, but do you remember your first exposure
for Kafka?
Yeah.
Yeah, very vividly, because I sort of made my first two friends in high school who shared my interest in literature.
Yeah.
And the three of us started reading The Trial to each other in the school library. Sometimes maybe it was free period. Sometimes maybe we weren't supposed to be there. Yeah. But we were reading The Trial to each other and laughing. And, it was never a surprise to me that Kafka was humorous the way it's often presented as like a surprising thing about Kafka. Yeah. We think of him as so grim, but he's humorous. We were laughing from day one. It just took off from there. We continued to read to each other. I remember sitting in the back of a car on the way to a concert, the three of us reading The Judgment and laughing when he discovers his father's underwear is unclean.
Yeah.
It never stopped. I got to college and I did a junior semester in Prague, where I wandered around, in Kafka's footsteps for however many months I was there. In fact, that experience really informed my translation process of the diaries, because I discovered when I was translating entries about his walks through Prague or his movement through his city or the views he could see or anything about the sort of topography of Prague, I didn't have to do any research because the city hasn't changed much. The biggest changes to the kind of streetscape, apart from one or two that didn't affect anything in the diaries, happened before Kafka was born with the so-called sanitation of the Jewish quarter. I realized I had this tactile sense of the city that Kafka had too, and that when I was translating those entries, the street names were different because they were German for him and they were Czech when I was there. But I knew especially the big boulevards and so on, the big streets, I knew which ones he was discussing. And I had this, speaking about the sort of bodily, tactile nature of the diaries, that was available to me just by virtue of having taken so many walks. Yeah. Of the same walks that Kafka took in Prague, in those same areas that haven't changed very much physically in terms of the streetscape and the bridges and the river. And so that was actually a very pleasurable aspect of translating this.
Nice.
Yeah.
It reminds me of Robert Caro having some passage early on in his Lyndon Johnson work where he just didn't understand why Johnson was describing certain things the way he was until he visited the Texas state legislature and saw the sunrise around the time that Johnson in the day would have been, going up these stairs. Mm-hmm. Oh, okay. No, I get what he's talking about now. Like the whole physical and environmental framework became clear to him in terms of the world that Johnson was living in those early days in state legislature.
100%. Yeah.
Yeah. I space matters in that respect. How do you feel about outliving Kafka? You're older than he was now, right?
Yeah.
Weird?
In a way, I'm glad that I finished I delivered it to my publisher right around the time I turned 40, the age that he was when he died. Mm-hmm. I had a little bit of time in there because he was nearly 41 when he died. But in a way, I was never translating where I was at an age that Kafka never reached. And so to the extent that... I don't know how much that matters. It felt like it mattered. Yeah. I don't suppose I could make an argument that actually matters, external to my own experience. Yeah. But in my own experience, it felt right to be always at an age that he was at. And he died childless and lamented quite, or from time to time lamented, but quite strongly in his diaries, not having children, not being able to start a domestic life, which he did idealize as much as he feared it or dreaded it, or felt incapable of it. And so it's interesting having children in these years, and let's forget about that.
I was just say, just diverging from the life he led, or just some of the patterns of how he led.
Right, it's the same paths that everybody confronts at these ages, and you take one path or a different one, but it's the same questions that you're asking yourself about how you want your life to go on from these ages. And so it was as immediate to me at that time as it was to Kafka when he was writing about it, because I was the same age. Yeah. And the years roughly correspond. When I started in 2014, I often joked, well, as long as I'm done by 2023, it will be a centennial of when the diaries were written, because they were written between 1909 and 1923. And I thought that was a joke, because I thought, of course, it will be published long before 2023.
What could possibly take so long?
Yeah. But it's true that I was within that sort of 100-year view, which is a artifice. It doesn't actually mean anything, but it's somehow the...
Okay, we make resonances. You know, we want to instill patterns on
right.
life.
And Kafka did it himself in the diaries, where he's writing about the judgment, and he's finding all these combinations of the letters in the people's names that show, Georg's name has 5 letters, and my name has 5 letters, and Frida Brandenfeld's name is FB, and Felice Bauer, my fiance that I've broken up with, is Felice Bauer. And so
and his great moment of checking into one of the sanatorium sort of hotels where they list him as Joseph K instead of it's K, or at least according to him.
And he says, should they enlighten me or should I enlighten them? Because they came up with it somehow. Yeah, they didn't know the work, of course. It was just a rough draft he was writing.
Your favorite part of the diaries? I guess either in terms of, I don't know, just your favorite part, you know.
I don't think I have a favorite part of the diaries. Some of the stories are extraordinary that, were never published as stories. They're diary stories. There's one called Memories of the Calda Railroad. You find out later it will be called that because he refers to it as such. It's not titled in the moment when he's writing it. And there's one about somebody who wakes up to his friends knocking at the door because he was late for the appointment and with them, and they say, "What's up behind your head?" And he has the hilt of a sword sticking up behind his head, and they realize that a sword has been inserted in between like the skin of his back and the muscle in a way that it hasn't even caused any blood. It's just like in a slit in his back. And and then they take it out and he's fine. And then he says something at the end about these knights running around in our dreams whose swords barely glance off of living flesh, thankful for them and for friends who show up in the morning, ready to help or something like that. It's just a perfect story that for some reason, he didn't, for reasons we've maybe discussed, he didn't ever decide to put out in the world. And there's many gems like that. But of course, there's also the moments of intense self-examination and self-revelation that are incredibly moving. And there's the last entry, which I could read maybe is the best way to... it's the last chronological entry, I should say, because these are organized by notebook and the travel diaries are appended at the end. So it takes a moment just to make sure. Okay, so this is the last entry of the diary, of the last chronological entry he wrote. It was in 1923. More and more anxious while writing. It is understandable. Every word twisted in the hand of the spirits. This flourish of the hand is their characteristic movement, becomes a spear turned against the speaker. A remark like this most especially, and so on to infinity. The consolation would be only, it happens whether you want it or not. And what you want helps only imperceptibly little. More than consolation is, you too have weapons.
That's why I'm I made a point. I knew I wasn't going to be able to read the whole shebang, but I thought definitely the first notebook, definitely the last notebook, and reaching that paragraph at the end just, yeah. Well, I plotzed, to use our Yiddish. Instead of favorite part, were there recurring words or themes that you weren't expecting in terms of, did you notice there are certain either phrases or just uses of language that, it keeps cropping up again and again. And, I didn't see that in the English, but.
Yeah, well, for Kafka, and it's not only in the diaries, but it's extreme in the diaries. He uses all these little German words that are basically particles. We don't really have them in English, but we have adverbs and phrases that we use that kind of qualify or inflect a sentence, where we'd say, that's how I had to translate these little particles. Or, German's often characterized or even satirized for its really long words, but it also has these tiny words, like just the word ja, which means yes, is also can be inserted in a sentence in a way that can just emphasize something that can it can do a lot of different things. A lot of these words are slippery where when you insert them, depending how they're inserted or how you read what the person's saying, especially in writing where you don't have the tone of voice, they inflect tone where you don't know if the word is actually emphasizing, or sometimes it can create a kind of concession, like, I would translate them often with something like, it is true, or, well, there's some of them like that, or to be sure, or certainly. Yeah. The to be sure and certainly and after all, those three I relied on a lot because those are three that you can't quite explain what they mean. And depending on their usage, they could do what some of these particles do, which is to, after all, could kind of emphasize something, but it could also be a kind of concession or
sort of undercutting.
Yeah, it can undercut. And same with certainly, in fact, even though certainly you would think would just mean it's certainly true. Yeah. Sometimes you sort of say it to kind of admit something, but you're admitting something ancillary to your main point, So this is part of what makes Kafka so very slippery. And he uses these words constantly. He uses what you would think of as filler words, also sort of discursive words that we use in English, or that maybe we try not to use when we're trying to be breezy and elegant, moreover, and what's more, and in addition, and on top of that, or these all mean the same thing, but there are different ones, therefore, and, these sorts of words. He uses those kind of discursive words all the time, too. And all of that, I think, serves to enhance the ambiguity of his writing at this sort of microscopic level, especially the small words. I think a lot of translators have tended to avoid translating them at all because they fear ending up with a kind of word salad of, to be sures. And I went the other route. And that's not the route I usually get. Quite often when you're translating, these little words in German disappear, and sometimes you lament it because you think, oh, that had a nice thing to it, but to add in a to be sure here would just be too much, But in this case, that tonal ambiguity felt so key to me to how he wrote in the diaries and to expressing this multivalence that can't be resolved, that I nearly always tried to find a way to put something in the sentence that served a similar function as those words, or to turn the sentence in a certain way. Sometimes in English there could be something like, he says something at one point like, these writings, trivial as they are, have had a strengthening effect on me. So you could do a little, the German, there was like an adverb and then the word trivial that had the same kind of inflection where you might just have translated it as like, these trivial writings, if you just let the adverb drop.
Yeah, I understand.
But by creating this phrase, trivial as they are, you're kind of, again, conceding something that you're about to refute, which is often a move that he's making. And it's often a move he's making that you could fail to notice that, and you might think he's actually making an argument that he's actually setting up to overturn. Right. And that happens again and again in the diaries. And sometimes I would catch them late where I would think, he has this entry where he talks about Max Brod, his friend, being criticized in a review for a reading he gave. And he says, allerdings von einem Fackelmensch, which means, which I ended up translating as by a Fackel man. Fackel is a journal that was had antipathy toward Brod at this time, And so what he's actually saying is like, admittedly, it was somebody from this journal, the Fackel, who's criticizing Brode, so they might have had an ulterior motive, and that's all contained in this one little word, allerdings, which I think I translated as by a Fackel man, to be sure, because you're again kind of conceding something. Or admitting something.
Yeah, highlighting it, but...
that allerdings, allerdings can mean absolutely or indeed, and it didn't jump out at me at first, and the sort of intuition would be initially, without realizing this about Kafka's writing and how key this is, would be maybe just drop it and say, he was criticized by a Fackel writer or whatever. But I realized that to be sure, and then it warranted a footnote too to explain, what the context was of that, to be sure. Yeah.
Do you feel this made you a better translator, or a better translator of Kafka? Do you feel the things you developed, the skills you developed in the process of this,
I think if I were ever to translate Kafka again, they would inform the sort of strategies that I came up with, would inform how I approached Kafka in the future.
But other German language work?
Not necessarily. It's kind of a cliche to say, but a lot of the work, the approach arises from the specific demands that the work makes. And the thing I just described about how quite often you might let these particles drop when you're translating because it's just too much to... The English word is just too clunky or too over-emphatic when the German word is such a minor intrusion in the sentence. And sometimes it's just not that important. And it really depends on from sentence to sentence and from writer to writer. And so the idea of taking this very emphatic approach that I took with Kafka of mostly trying to translate those types of things would not transfer to many other works unless there happened to be a writer again who used them that way, or there happened to be a sentence in which a writer was using them that way. I mean, really the only theory of translating Kafka can be articulated by doing it only, which makes it not a theory. It's just a practice.
Gets us back to that question on whether one can be qualified to do this before doing it.
You can only do it, and then it needs to keep being done, and people need to keep doing it. And will. I mean, that's the thing about translation, is it always goes on. There are always new translations, and just as there's always reconsiderations and new critical to things that live on, there's always new engagement with them and reinvention. And
it does raise my big question of, after this project, what comes next? Without jinxing yourself.
I don't have something lined up, so I don't have like a real concrete answer. I don't think it will be Kafka, the very next thing I do. There may be Kafka in my future. Even as I did this project, I speak about 8 years working on this. There was probably nearly a full year where it was with some editors at my previous publisher with whom I ended up, breaking over irreconcilable creative differences. During that year, I translated another work, so that would already be kind of next. It was sort of after, which was by a contemporary author, Daniel Kehlmann, who's such a breath of fresh air when you've been translating Kafka, because not only because you can speak with him and work with him, but also because his writing is pleasurable to translate in a way that Kafka's is not always. Sure. There's puns and sparkle and wit, and not that Kafka doesn't have any of that, but that, with Kehlmann, that's very much...
But it's also a finished book.
The fun of translating it. It's a finished book. A living author. There's many things that make it incredibly refreshing. And I'm going to continue translating Kehlmann, and he's still writing, and there will be new things. Hopefully soon. I can't make any announcements on his behalf, and writers take as long as they take. But Kehlmann is a very fertile and productive writer. But I don't know what is precisely next.
Sure. You bringing up something like that, one of my Twitter followers, when I mentioned I was going to be interviewing you, just asked for me. He said, I can only do Kafka in small doses. What was it like being immersed year upon year? And did he have to decompress and, get out with other literature and just get away sometimes? The fact that your child just describes you as doing Kafka sounds like it was pretty all-consuming for
consuming.
stretches. So.
It was consuming, and it was any really daunting project that ends up
being a long scope.
Being so consuming, and being such a long scope. There are times where you really feel oppressed under the burden of the work and really isolated and nowhere near finished. And, the sheer mental strain sometimes of working through Kafka while also, having two little kids and so on. I would have days where I really thought I need to get 5 pages done. I'm not making enough progress. I need to get 10 pages done. And it was very rare that I got more than 2 or 3 pages done a day at most, because under that strain and trying to live a life at the same time, I would end up just falling asleep on my desk. I had a big fat German dictionary that ended up, getting softer and more supple as I turned the pages over the years, and was my, de facto pillow. So it was like this struggle to make progress, and then find myself sleeping part of the day away that I needed to work. Again, it felt like a very Kafka-like predicament to be kind of tenaciously trying to make progress while feeling paralyzed, or where the progress and the paralysis seem to be symbiotic in a way that gets you nowhere. So yes, there were, all the satisfaction that I'm getting now is enhanced by, the satisfaction of people reading it and responding to it and feeling excited about it. All that is hugely enhanced by how it felt during those years of immersion and of not feeling like I might ever be able to swim my way out. And my daughter drew me a picture congratulating me. Just the most, this actually finally moved me to tears when my daughter gave me this picture. And some of the things she sort of based it on the cover, the gorgeous cover design by Peter Mendelssohn of this edition of the diaries. But she wrote on it all kinds of congratulatory messages. And she wrote like, "We believed it," which showed that she picked up on the fact that maybe there were times when none of us did believe that it would. And it said like finished, this, the idea like, I need to finish this. Is he going to finish it? And that there was some concern, not just among everybody else, but also my own, of whether I would ever come out at the other end. So that probably gives the texture of how it felt over this time. And as far as like getting out and getting that fresh air, absolutely being able to I did 2 books by Kehlmann in the time that I was working on this, where I was able to set time aside and do these books. That was majorly refreshing and rejuvenating, getting outside of Kafka's head and into a contemporary fiction writer.
Yeah, I was going to ask, not necessarily for translating, but did you have other escape valve literature, just things that...
For reading?
Yeah, I've just spent too much time with Kafka. I need to...
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. I mean, some of what I was reading was inspired by Kafka, but it still was refreshing, like because Kafka was very influenced by Dickens and Flaubert. I thought I should be reading some Dickens and Flaubert to try to get my own feel for that influence. And so I read Little Dorrit, which I knew Kafka had read. I loved Little Dorrit. And I read Bleak House, which it's not actually, there isn't hard evidence Kafka read it, but there's a ton of circumstantial evidence that he read it, including the entire novel, The Trial, unfinished novel, The Trial, circumstantial evidence, although you could maybe read Little Dorrit and be inspired to write The Trial without, because of the circumlocution office and so on. But Bleak House also seemed worth reading, and Madame Bovary. I always read a lot of English language literature on purpose, and not, while I'm translating German literature. So it's maybe even more necessary when translating Kafka, but I always find it necessary to keep myself infused with great English language prose, because that's what I have to produce.
Yeah, ultimately,
not necessarily the kind of prose I'm reading, but I need to produce English prose. So that's always been an MO of mine. I read a lot of German literature in German, but I also make sure to have a near constant infusion of
good English prose. Yeah. blurb that freaked you out the most when it came in? Not to discredit anybody else who blurbed the book, but was there one that you had a holy crap, I can't believe,
Well, J.M. Katsea, that he blurbed it at all and then wrote such a lovely and affirming blurb. And then Cynthia Ozick's blurb, also that she blurbed it, but also what she wrote in the blurb was so I could read it.
Yeah.
In the presence of Max Brode's mediating intrusions as his editor, have we ever really known Kafka's authentic voice? This new and scrupulously faithful translation of the diaries brings us, unembellished by theory, the true inner life of the 20th century's most complex and enigmatic literary prophet, whose very name has come to us as symbol and vision of innocent vulnerability in the face of irrational force, yet warns, beware interpretation. It's just such a beautiful prose poem of a blurb, and Cynthia Ozick has always had my awestruck admiration. So that one, meant so much to me. But I do have to say that all of them gave me such a thrill.
I don't want you to dismiss everybody else, but just ones that you had oh my God.
Because those were the first responses that told me, okay, people are responding to it in the way I respond to the German edition and the way the response I was hoping to elicit in my translation. I up until that point, I had a few readers who got it, who knew what I was trying to do, but I hadn't, those were the first voices I heard, and voices, of course, that of people whose opinion I most respect and regard. But that also were assigned to me. Okay, at the very least, it's succeeded in eliciting those responses from those people.
Yeah, I gotta say, I've done the show now for 11 years. I'm in my 11th year, and I think this is the first, we did this 7 years ago, and now we're seeing it complete. Mm-hmm. The idea that, not that I was around for you in this whole process, but seeing something you talked about and were in the process of, and seeing it culminate in something as amazing as this, it's to me, it's pretty neat having that level of continuity, I guess, and for you having lived it, and then it's out, and now it's now you have hard copies, you've got you're seeing what people's response is like.
Yeah,
that's got to be. I hope you're enjoying the moment. Yeah.
Completely enjoying the moment because
outside of this one, of course, where I show up and go on.
that this is what it's for. I mean, obviously, the experience of translating it, the activity of translating it, is also what it's for. That's the part that's just me, but the purpose of it is so that it reaches people who can read it in English. And so, getting these responses is good for my ego, of course, but it's incredibly good for my sense of purpose, much more so, in fact, than because for your ego, you always have anything that's good for your ego is also potentially threatening to your ego because it could be taken away. Mm-hmm. And then as soon as somebody says something negative, then you're plunged into despair. So that's not even really safe. Yeah. But what I feel very safe with is that feeling of the purpose, that it's that I've served the purpose I meant to serve by getting this to people who are interested in it and who are excited by it.
I will ask you what you're reading next, but it's again, along the lines of what I do with the show, I usually ask people about what their dream project is. And when we talked 7 years ago, this was your dream project. Again, this ties into the what comes next idea, but is there a sense, not of a letdown, but just wow, I achieved this and I'm 40-ish, I've got more ahead of me still, do you still have a sense of, there are big projects to scale while there's still, the
not everything has to be a monumental and big project. Kaleman is a hugely important and exciting writer that I'm so thrilled to be his translator, and continuing to work on his work is a privilege that I'm looking forward to as much as ever. And something similar could be said, or the same could be said about Clemens Zetz, whose work is not as well known in English, but who's a major figure in German language literature and who has a new novel coming out. Either it's just come out or it's just about to come out, and whose work I've been translating little bits of, and a novel of his called Indigo that I translated some time ago. That's not as widely read as I personally obviously think it deserves to be. And I've translated stories and poems, many of which can be found on my website, in fact, or links to them when they do live on the internet. His work is something I've always wanted to stay attached to and dreamed of doing more of, and believe deeply in its deservingness of being in English and being out there, and have always felt, slightly aggrieved that that hasn't happened yet, but also confident that there will be a day where the English language world takes notice of the richness of his literary production, which is pretty extensive already by now in Germany, because he rose at a very young age to really high prominence in the German language landscape. So those are two authors that I continue to be as excited about as anything that I may get to do in the future.
It's good to know a dream project doesn't have to be a decade-long
dream project. I did that one. And,
so good.
I'm glad I did it, but also I learned from doing it that that's not something you want to do for every project.
So real last question, who are you reading?
What's funny, or I don't know if it's sad. It's definitely not sad. What's funny is that I'm reading some Kafka right now. I'm talking about Kafka a lot, so it also feels... Yeah,
you should have it as a background.
Yeah, it's like background, but, I'm going back to the posthumous writings that are not diaries, and picking and choosing among them. I just reread his letter to his father that he never, that was never delivered to his father because his mother refused to deliver to his father, thank goodness. But which is a piece of great literary value. It's not just of biographical value. It's an incredible piece of writing. And I'm rereading his posthumous story that's often titled Investigations of a Dog in German. So I'm flipping through the posthumous writings and picking and choosing and dipping in and out, which is something I always suggest people could also do with the diaries, with these, because one has to remember that all of the writings that Broad preserved and published were just a mass of materials. You can organize them in different ways. There are probably better and worse ways to organize them. But as a reader, you can really think of this as just a kind of smorgasbord or something from which you could...
I was going to go highbrow Kafka continuum, but smorgasbord works too.
Let's go with that.
I'd like to have you on again fewer than 7 years from now. So, I'm hoping we can sit down again.
We'll have to work
soon.
faster. Yeah.
But Ross, thanks so much for coming on. I really appreciate it.
Thank you very much for having me.
And this is like I said, this is an amazing achievement, and I'm glad to have seen it sort of at the beginning and to see it come to culmination like this.
Well, I really appreciate your talking to me about it. Thank you.
And that was Ross Benjamin. I cannot overstate how amazing his translation of the diaries is. Like I've mentioned, I've only read about a quarter of it. It's about 600 pages before notes. I've done about 125, 150. And it's not only been illuminating about Kafka's life and creative process, it's also sort of unlocked some of my own creativity and got me exploring more in writing, even just in my journal, than I have in years. So for a lot of reasons, you should go pick up The Diaries of Franz Kafka, out now from Schocken Books. Schocken is Schocken. Now, you should also go check out more of Ross's work at his website, rossmbenjamin.com, which is ROSS, M as in man, BENGAMIN.com. That's got links to the books he's translated, his own writing, press appearances, videos of his public events, and more. So go check it out. He's also on Twitter as Ross M. Benjamin, all one word, spelled the same way as his site. He's a bit new to Twitter, but he's getting used to kind of jumping in, mainly to just chime in on conversations about Kafka and people who are referencing the diaries there. And as I look right now, he is also on Instagram under the same handle, Ross M. Benjamin, just starting out with posts there. I'll have links to all of this in the show and episode notes for this one. Now, you can support the Virtual Memory Show by telling other people about it. Just let them know there is this podcast out there with this guy doing these conversations with really interesting cultural figures every single week. You can also help out the show by telling me what you like and don't like about it. Tell me who you think I should record with, or what movie or TV show or book or piece of music or new translation or piece of theater, art exhibition, whatever you think I should turn listeners on to. And you can do that by sending me a postcard. I love postcards. I mail a postcard every mail day of the year. I started that last January, as New Year's resolutions go, and I kept it up the whole time. I'm continuing it this year. I'm recording this on Martin Luther King Day, so there's no postcard today, but tomorrow I'll get back to it. Anyway, you can reach out to me by postcard, letter, email, or leave me a message on my Google Voice number, which is 973-869-9659. Messages, well, that goes directly to voicemail, so you don't have to worry about actually having to talk to me. And messages go up to 3 minutes long. So if you go longer than that, just call back and leave a second message. And let me know if it would be cool to include your message in an upcoming episode of the show. You might have something to say that the listeners would be interested in, but I would never run something like that without the speaker's permission. So give me a call and let me know if I can share it with everybody. Now, if you got money to spare, don't give it to me. I mean, I've started a Substack now. I moved my weekly email list over there, and I'll start a pay tier for that soon with like transcriptions of past episodes, behind the scenes stuff, and other work. But for now, really, my day job treats me fine. Driving out to Ross's, it was just gas money basically to do that. Well, anyway, where he lives is no tolls or anything, just about a half-hour drive for me. Although while I was out there, I did realize or discover the day before that Edward Hopper is buried in a cemetery about a quarter mile from Ross's place. So I, after we finished up, drove over there, went up and checked out Hopper's grave. Not very Hopper-esque, but, you know, it was still one of those things I felt good about going out and seeing. Anyway, if you do have money to spare, give it to people in need or institutions in need. You can find people through GoFundMe, Patreon, Kickstarter, Crowdfunder, other crowdfunding platforms. There are people who need help with rent, with medical bills, with getting artistic projects off the ground, and lots of other stuff. If you're looking for institutions to give to, I give to my local food bank every month. I make donations to the Poor People's Campaign sometimes. I make targeted election contributions, Planned Parenthood, Women's Choice funds. There are other places you can contribute and try to help make a difference in this world. So I hope you will. Our music for this episode is Fella by Hal Mayforth, used with permission from the artist. You should visit my archives to check out my episode with Hal from the summer of 2018 and learn more about his art and painting. And you can listen to his music at soundcloud.com/Mayforth. And that's MAY4TH. And that's it for this week's episode of the Virtual Memories Show. Thanks so much for listening. We'll be back next week with another great conversation. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show and download past episodes at the iTunes Store. You can also find all our episodes and get on our email list at either of our websites, vmspod.com or chimeraobscura.com/VM. You can also follow the Virtual Memories Show on Twitter and Instagram at vmspod, at virtualmemoriespodcast.tumblr.com, and on YouTube, Spotify, and TuneIn.com by searching for Virtual Memories Show. And if you like this podcast, please tell your pals, talk it up on social media, and go to iTunes, look up the Virtual Memories Show, and leave a rating and maybe a review for us. It all goes to helping us build a bigger audience. You've been listening to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth. Keep reading, keep making art, and keep the conversation going.